This is section 5.3. We're going to be talking about the greatest common factor and factoring by grouping. The homework assignment for 5.3 is problem numbers 34 through 46. Suppose you have a polynomial 2x squared plus 8x, and I want to factor it. Factoring is the opposite of multiplying. If I have a polynomial 2x squared plus 8x, and I want to factor out the greatest common factor, or the GCF, what I need to do is I need to look at my 2 and my 8, or my coefficients, and what number goes into both of them. Well, the largest number that goes into both 2 and 8 is 2, right there. You also have to look at your variable. So if I have an x squared and an x, what would be the largest variable, if you will, that goes into both of them? Well, they both have an x. One has an x squared, one has a plain x, but they do both have x. So the GCF would be 2x. So when I factor out the GCF, remember factoring is the opposite of multiplying. So you can think of factoring as dividing out. So if I have 2x squared and I divide out 2x, the 2 will cancel with the 2, and x squared, I've got x squared is x times x, so one of these x's will cancel with this x in the bottom. I'm left with x. If I divide out 2x, I'm left with x. As far as the second term goes, right here I have 8x, and I'm dividing out 2x. So dividing out 2x, 2 goes into 8 4 times, and the x will cancel with the x. So if I want to factor out the GCF, my answer is going to be 2x times the quantity x plus 4. Something with a few more terms, 14x cubed y minus 21x squared y squared plus 7x squared y. Want to factor out the GCF. Again, I'm going to look at the coefficients. Those are the numbers. See what is the largest number that goes into all three of those. I've got 14, negative 21, and 7. You'll notice that 7 goes into all three terms. We have to look at the variables. We've got x squareds, or x cubed, sorry, x squareds and x squareds. We need the largest variable that goes into all three. The largest variable that goes into all three is x squared. When you're doing the variables, think the smallest exponent they have in common. So that's what you're looking for. Smallest exponent they have in common. And y. So the first term has a y, second has a y squared, and the third one also has a y. So your greatest common factor, or GCF, is 7x squared y. You're going to factor it out. That means divide each term by 7x squared y. So if you divide the first term by 7x squared y, 7 goes into 14 twice. The y will cancel with the y, and x squared will cancel with 2 of those x's, and I'm left with a single x. Right here. Do the same thing for all three terms. You're going to divide out a 7x squared y. 7 goes into 21, negative 3 times. The x squared will cancel with the x squared. The y with one of these y's up here, and I'm left with negative 3y. Be careful on this last one. If I'm dividing 7x squared y by 7x squared y, the answer is not 0. The answer is 1. 7x squared y, divide out 7x squared y is 1. You do have to put the 1 and don't forget to write that 1. If you want to check your answer, you can actually multiply these two polynomials together. So example 1, we have 40x minus 20. We want to factor out the GCF, or the greatest common factor. What we want to do is look for what they have in common. What's the largest number they have in common? They both have a 20. We can take out a 20. We also have to look at the variable. Notice the first term has an x, but the second term does not. So we cannot factor out an x. So I'm going to have my 40x, and I want to divide out a 20. If I divide out 20, 40 divided by 20 will give you 2, and the x is still there. I'm not canceling that. The second term, I want to divide out a 20, and 20 goes into negative 20, negative 1 time. If you look at example 2, we want to factor out the GCF. We look for the coefficient, or the number, that they all have in common. The largest number is 7. Notice the first term has an x, the second one a y, and the third one doesn't have any variable. They do not have any variable in common, so we're not going to factor out a variable. When we divide out a 7, we get 2x. Divide out a 7, we get y. Divide out a 7, we get negative 1. This looks different, but it's actually doing the same thing. What I want to do is figure out what they have in common and factor it out or divide it out. So if you look at this first term and this second term, you'll notice that they both have a y plus 15. What we're going to do is we're going to divide it out. We're going to put it out front, divide it out, and see what's left over. So if I divide out a y plus 15, what's left? Well, the y plus 15s are gone, and I have an x. If you look at the second term, remember I'm dividing out y plus 15. If I divide out the y plus 15, I'm left with a negative 2. Example 4, what I'm looking for is what they have in common. Notice they both have an a minus b, so I'm going to divide it out, or factor it out, and check to see what's left over. If I divide out an a minus b, divide out an a minus b, I'm left with 8a and a positive 1. A minus b times 8a plus 1. Example 5 and 6, I'm going to have you do that on your own. We're going to do a process that I call factoring by grouping. You do this when you have 4 terms. Notice I have an x cubed, 2x squared, 3x, and a 6. I've got 4 terms. When you have 4 terms, you can't factor in you can't use the box method, you can't use algebra tiles. So you've got to use a different method. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at the first 2 terms and see what they have in common. So I'm going to look at the x cubed and the 2x squared. And what do they have in common? Well, they have an x squared in common. So I divide out an x squared, but just from the first 2 terms, only the first 2 terms. Divide out x squared, I'm left with x plus 2. I'm going to repeat the process with the last 2 terms. See what they have in common. I have 3x plus 6, and they both have a 3. You do have to write the plus. So we've got a positive 3. And when we divide out a positive 3, I'm left with x plus 2. At this point, I want you to notice that they both have an x plus 2. We divide out the x plus 2. What's left? The x squared and the positive 3. So your answer when you factor this is x plus 2 times x squared plus 3. Another example doing the same thing. I'm going to skip this one. You can read through this yourself. If you have questions, let me know. So I'm going to do example 7. I'm going to factor by grouping because I have 4 terms. When I factor by grouping, I look at the first 2 terms and the last 2 terms separately. So for now, I'm going to look at the first 2 terms and check to see what they have in common. Notice they both have an x. I'm going to factor out an x just from the first 2 terms. If I divide out an x, this x will cancel with this one, I'm left with y. This x will cancel with this one, I'm left with a positive 11. For the second 2 terms, you have to be careful here because this is negative. So with the second 2 terms, whatever that sign is the sign of what you have to factor out. So they both have 6's, but you're going to use a negative 6 because of this negative right here. So negative 6, you're dividing out a negative 6. Be very careful when dividing out a negative 6. If I divide out a negative 6 here and here, I'm left with a positive y. The negative 66, you're dividing out a negative 6. Negative divided by negative is positive 11. Watch for that negative on the second, on this number right there. They both have a y plus 11. I'm going to divide it out, y plus 11. What's left? X minus 6. Example 8. I'm going to factor by grouping. I've got 4 terms. The first set, they both have a 3. And when I divide it out, I have y minus 12. The second set, they both have an x. This is positive, so you have to write positive x. You divide out a positive x, you're left with y minus 12. These two have to match exactly. When you're doing this process, those have to match exactly, including signs. Y minus 12, 3 plus x. Example 9 and 10, I'm going to have you do on your own. And that concludes section 5.3 video. Ask me any questions you have on this video. Let me know what questions you have tomorrow in class.